Welcome to number 95 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the standing orders. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. I would like to make a few comments for the benefit of witnesses and members. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. To prevent disruptive audio feedback incidents during our meeting, we kindly ask that all participants keep their earpieces away from any microphone. Audio feedback incidents can seriously injure interpreters and disrupt our proceedings. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. Pursuant the order of reference on Monday, March 27, 2023, the committee resumes its study of Bill C-26, an act respecting cybersecurity, amending the Telecommunications Act and making consequential amendments to other acts. With us today, appearing, Honourable Dominic LeBlanc, MP, Minister of Public Safety, Democratic Institutions and Intergovernmental Affairs, welcome. Honourable François-Philippe Champagne, MP, Minister of Innovation, Science and Industry, welcome. Witnesses, Department of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness, Patrick Boucher, Senior Assistant Deputy Minister, National Cybersecurity Branch, Colin McSween, Director General, National Cybersecurity Directorate, Kellyanne Gibson, Acting Director, National Cybersecurity Directorate, Department of Industry, Eric Desjardins, Senior Assistant Deputy Minister, Spectrum and Telecommunications Sector, and Mark Shawn, Senior Assistant Deputy Minister, Strategy and Innovation Policy Sector. Please note that the ministers will be with us for 1 hour and 30 minutes, and officials will stay for the rest of the meeting in order to answer questions from members. Colleagues, to add to that, and I spoke to most of you prior to the meeting, we need about 10 to 15 minutes before the end of the meeting to deal with committee business items such as budgets and committee schedule. Welcome to all. I now invite Minister LeBlanc and Mr. Champagne to make an opening statement. Up to 10 minutes each is given for the opening statement. Thank you. Minister LeBlanc, will you start?
With pleasure, Mr. Chair, with a lot of pleasure. Alors, merci, Monsieur le Président.
So thank you, Chair. Thank you, colleagues, for having invited me to speak to you about Bill C-26, an act respecting cybersecurity. I'm pleased to be here today with my colleague, Mr. Champagne, and the officials.
Increasingly interconnected, interdependent, and integrated with cyber systems. Canada's critical infrastructure plays a vital role in the delivery of essential services and the necessities of daily life. In order to safeguard our economic and national security, we need to take a more complete picture of the cyber security threats facing Canadians, and we believe that Bill C-26 will be an important step in accomplishing that task. This proposed legislation will protect Canadians and bolster cyber security across the federally regulated financial, telecommunications, energy, and transportation sectors. These sectors are all critical contributors to both Canada's economy and the security of Canadians as well. And because of their vitality, they are also obviously attractive targets for malicious, cyber-enabled activity, such as espionage, data and intellectual property theft, and of course, sabotage itself. These concerns are not just hypothetical. Recently, the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity joined Five Eyes operational partners in warning that the People's Republic of China state-sponsored cyber actors are seeking to pre-position themselves for disruptive or destructive cyber attacks against the United States critical infrastructure in the event of a major crisis or conflict with our neighbour to the south. Cyber incidents are happening in our critical infrastructure sectors on almost a daily basis. In January 2023, CBC News reported that a territorial and Crown corporation and the sole energy distributor in Nunavut fell victim to a cyber attack. In June of last year, the Calgary Herald reported that Canadian energy company Suncor suffered a serious cyber incident, shutting down debit and credit processing at Petro-Canada gas stations across the country. And we all remember the cyber incidents that paralyzed the Newfoundland and Labrador healthcare system in 2021. Bill C-26 will help defend our critical infrastructure and the essential services that Canadians and Canadian businesses rely on every day. This new act will increase collaboration and information sharing between industry and government and will require designated operators to report cybersecurity incidents to the Communications Security Establishment, as colleagues know, an agency within the Department of National Defence. By improving the government's awareness of the cyber threat landscape in these critical federally regulated sectors, we can warn operators of potential threats and vulnerabilities so they can take action to protect their systems and to protect Canadians as well. Mais le gouvernement ne peut pas.
But the government can't do it alone. That's why we're committed to working closely with our industry partners through the formal regulatory process in order to create a clear, consistent, and harmonized regulatory regime across all jurisdictions.
Work alongside our allies, in particular the United States, to make sure that our interconnected critical infrastructure is protected. This legislation is consistent with the cyber security approaches of our allies, and we have been engaging with international partners to identify opportunities for further collaboration. And as recently as Tuesday of this week, I participated in a Five Eyes ministerial call where Secretary Mayorkas, the U.S. Homeland Security Secretary, raised many of the issues that we're going to talk about this morning. Nous avons constaté que les intervenants.
We have observed that the stakeholders broadly support the intent of the bill and agree that we must work together to protect our critical infrastructure from cyber threats. However, some have expressed concerns about certain aspects of the bill. We have obviously listened carefully to the points raised by our colleagues at the House of Commons and other stakeholders regarding transparency, accountability, and the protection of Canadians' privacy. Fundamentally, this legislation will help protect the confidentiality of Canadians' personal information. Canada's critical infrastructure systems, while secure, are not impenetrable. By requiring Canada's critical infrastructure operators to maintain high levels of cybersecurity, we're also reducing the likelihood of data breaches on their systems, which often contain personal information and data. I look forward, Mr. Chair, to working with you in the committee on these issues to ensure the speedy passage of this bill. We can introduce the necessary amendments to strengthen this bill, and we want to ensure that Canadians are safe, competitive, and connected in a context of greater security. So I will be happy to listen to my colleague, François Philippe. That's why I'm here this morning, and to answer our colleagues' questions.
Merci, Monsieur le Ministre. Monsieur le Ministre, Champagne, à vous.
Thank you, Chair. It's a great privilege for me to be with you today. It's been I've been a MP for 7 or 8 years, and I've been appearing in front of committees. But I think this morning is especially important. You know that I've had the privilege of appearing here with Minister LeBlanc because that shows Canadians how important this issue is, because Mr. LeBlanc has already explained why we're here today, and I think people must be reassured to see that Minister LeBlanc is working in consultation with the Department of Industry. You know, the issue of cybersecurity is something that touches our SMEs, families, that affects all institutions in the country and even abroad. I can tell you that in various forums where I've been internationally, the issue of cybersecurity, when we add everything that's quantic, everything that's related to AI, it's hugely important, and that's why I'm proud to appear here today with the Minister LeBlanc, who's a great friend. And as I was saying, I'm happy to be able to have this opportunity to discuss with you this critically important piece of legislation. I think people expect that we act quickly in an issue where things are evolving very quickly. It's one of the most important things that we can do as legislators is to protect our critical infrastructure throughout the country.
I take a particular interest in securing Canada's telecommunications system. Telecommunications networks are vital to the safety, prosperity, and well-being of Canadians. And I would say when you've seen disaster striking around the nation, one thing I can tell you is that citizens expect their telecom network to work. And that's why adding, like we're going to be doing in this law, the concept of security as an objective under the Telecom Act is so crucial. It's not only about cybersecurity, but it's about protecting Canadians in the times when they need most. That's why we're committed to protecting the telecommunications system that underpins much of our critical infrastructure in the country. Just take the emergence of new technologies, such as 5G, as one clear reason why we need to redouble the focus. Why? Because, as you know, 5G is going to have a network which is far more decentralized. You're talking about the Internet of Things. You're talking about connecting, I would say, almost everything. The object will become intelligent and be connected. So if you think about the impact of cybersecurity and that, you understand the size of the problem and the emergency, and I would say not only emergency powers we need, but also the duty to act that we all have as parliamentarians. Les menaces auxquelles ces technologies et ces systèmes doivent faire face sont de plus en plus.
The threats facing these technologies and systems are increasing constantly, from threats to our supply chains to cybersecurity threats from state and non-state actors. It is with these dangers in mind that the government has conducted a thorough review of 5G technology. I'd like to thank all of the officials who are here with us, from industry and public safety, who have done a very detailed examination. We have examined it from a technical, because there are many technical issues here, as my colleague Mr. LeBlanc said, and also issues of national security.
Will bring significant benefits. It will also introduce new security concerns that malicious actors could exploit, as 5G networks are more interconnected than ever. Therefore, threats will have a more significant impact on the safety and security of Canadians, including our critical infrastructure, than in previous network generations. It is in light of this security examination that the Government of Canada found serious concerns about suppliers such as Huawei and ZTE. You will recall that in May of 2022, we announced the intention to prohibit Canadian telecommunications services providers from using Huawei and ZTE products and services in their 5G and 4G networks. Notre énoncé précisait dans ce temps que les mesures.
Our statement has indicated that proposed measures would be subject to consultation. However, the risks associated with telecommunications go well beyond security. As I've said, we've already taken action when we made this political statement in May 2022.
People will remember, Canadians watching will remember the famous Rogers outage in the summer of 2022, which probably impacted, 12 million Canadians for a number of hours. And with the after effects of Hurricane Lee in Atlantic Canada in September 2023, my colleague Minister LeBlanc was really involved in restoring the services that people need. So I want colleagues to understand this is not just about national security, but the role of the industry minister is to ensure resiliency. And if you think about hurricane, if you think about the network outage we had with respect to Rogers, in the case of Rogers, we were successful to get a voluntary undertaking, and the memorandum we signed with them in September. But I think Canadians would be reassured that the minister would have legislative power to compel companies to do what's right. We know that these risks are not something market will or can solve on its own. That's why we need rules for the industry. Rules that protect Canadians, our networks, our businesses, and our data. Le projet de loi C-26 présenté aujourd'hui a été conçu pour faire face à ces risques et à l'évolution des menaces.
Bill C-26 introduced today is designed to address these risks and evolving threats. The bill will enable the government to act quickly when it's necessary to ensure strengthen network security. And I think the issue of powers that we will have are necessary in order to act rapidly, because in situations of emergency we have to act quickly and in a timely manner to prevent larger issues for the whole network. The second part of Bill C-26 will also strengthen the protection of our critical cyber systems, and I think Minister LeBlanc was highly involved.
Our telecommunication network is probably the backbone of infrastructure. I know people at home may think of infrastructure as bridges that we need to protect. They may think about nuclear power station, but I would tell you that the telecom network, which is basically enabling everything else, is one of the key network that we need to protect. But Mr. Chair, we want to make sure we get it right. As Minister LeBlanc said, that's why we listen carefully to the debates in the House of Commons, and obviously comments from stakeholders and colleagues which are here, because I would say when it comes to national security, that's not a partisan issue. And that's why we are committed to make sure that we do that in the best possible way. So I'm happy to see that there seems to be broad support for the bill and the objective of securing our telecom network. Nous voulons travailler de manière constructive pour obtenir le meilleur projet de loi possible.
We wish to work constructively in order to achieve the best possible result, but there's also an urgency to come to action. The actors who want to harm Canada are looking at the possible defects in the system, and so it's important to act quickly. So I look forward to the passage of Bill C-26 in order to better protect our critical infrastructures. So I'll be happy with my colleague Minister LeBlanc to answer the questions of our colleagues.
We're going to move right into questions. So I'm going to start with Mr. Shipley, please, for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the ministers and the officials for being here this morning. We are definitely talking about a very serious issue here with cybersecurity and Bill C-26. So, ministers, we'll just jump right in with a few questions if you don't mind. So, first off, the public safety, and this is for Minister LeBlanc, pardon me. Public Safety Canada recognizes 10 critical infrastructure sectors, one of which being government. A recent NCCOP report noted that several departments and Crown corporations are not subject to Treasury Board policies related to cyber defense or apply those cyber defense policies to their departments inconsistently, leaving them vulnerable to cyber attacks. In fact, just recently it was revealed that Global Affairs Canada was suffering from a massive data security breach. Minister LeBlanc, why is your own government not adhering to the same cybersecurity standards as the designated operators listed in this bill, whose confidential business and personal information you're planning to collect and store?
So, Mr. Chair, through you to Mr. Shipley, thank you for the question. Obviously, we took note of the work done by NSICOP. These are, for our government and for our department, important roadmaps to better public policy and better legislation. I'm aware of procurement initiatives underway across the government to improve many information systems which are either outdated or arriving at the end of their useful life and need to be reinforced. It's something that industry and businesses do every week and every month, and the government has the same obligation. So the premise of your question is, do we have in the Government of Canada an obligation to hold ourselves to the, at least to the standard we would expect of private industry? The answer is of course. And we're actively looking at ways, and you mentioned the Foreign Affairs Department. I'm aware in the public safety portfolio also where we're actively investing in modernizing systems and are constantly looking for good ideas and better solutions, including with our allies.
Thank you, Minister. This one's also for yourself, Minister LeBlanc. We've heard almost unanimously that this is an important bill, but this is also a poorly drafted bill. Business groups, civil liberties groups, cybersecurity firms are all united in the fact that Bill C-26 gives the government too much power with almost zero oversight. There is no requirement for regular reporting, no independent review, and no requirements for production of written reports. In fact, most of the powers in this bill would be exercised in secret. Do you think the sweeping powers that you're attempting to give yourself have enough oversight mechanisms attached to them?
Mr. Chair, again through you to Mr. Shipley, we've obviously taken note of the concerns expressed by the people that our colleague referred to. We would expect that in the work of this committee, if there are amendments that in your view answer some of these concerns. Of course, we would be open to working with the committee and to ensuring that collectively we get the best legislation we can. We recognize that these are extraordinary powers in many ways that require, as you noted, the appropriate oversight. There is an element of judicial oversight. But we also recognize that the threat landscape is evolving as well, and evolving very quickly. And some of the briefings I have from security officials, including at CSIS, the threat actors, including malicious state actors seeking to do some of the damage and disrupt some of these systems that we talked about, require the ability to move quickly and require the ability to help identify potential risks and hopefully prevent incidents from happening. That's why there are these powers, but recognizing that these powers come with an obligation of transparency in every case possible and the appropriate reviews, including judicial reviews. But François Philippe, you had a point on the judicial review?
If I may, Mr. Chair. No, I just want to add, obviously it's an important question, and we believe in oversight, like I said, judicial review, and also the concept of proportionality. But I just want to remind colleagues, when we had major storms, particularly in the East Coast, I had premiers even calling and asking us to take action. And like I said, in the telecom area, although now we have the memorandum we signed voluntarily with the telcos, I think Canadians and I think Member of Parliament would want any Minister of Industry or future Minister of Industry to also have the power to take action very quickly. You may recall that in some instances we were asked to direct the telcos to do certain things, because I can assure you that when you don't have access to 911 and you're facing an emergency, Canadians are very worried about that. So for us to be able to take remedial action or compel telecom companies to do certain things. Now they've done it voluntarily, and I think
Minister,
it's a good
thank
thing,
you.
but I don't think Canadians would want to rely just on a voluntary
Thank
basis.
you. I'm almost out of time, and I do have one next question for you, Minister Champagne. Many stakeholders have noted that the proposed penalties related to this act, which reach up to $15 million and 5 years of jail time, are touted as being intended to promote compliance rather than to punish. However, I think we can all agree a penalty of this nature would be very challenging for a small business to absorb. Has any consideration been made to the impact that these large fines will have on small and medium enterprises?
Well, I think in that, I would say respectfully to the committee, it's always a matter of balance. You want also, I would say respectfully to members of the committee, to have a fine which is also proportionate, because obviously you're referring to small and medium-sized businesses, but let's be clear that the systemic risk to our network also with very large players, and the danger to go too low, I would say, and colleagues would agree, if the fine is of a nature that, if you're talking about the big telcos, that it's kind of irrelevant. I'm not sure that would give the power that the Minister of Industry would have to compel them to take action, because I don't suggest they would do that, but they could do a cost-benefit analysis and say, listen, let's ignore the minister, because at the end of the day, you know what, the fine is so low that it's just business as usual. I think in case of emergency, I can tell you when we had storms, the Rogers outage touching 12 million Canadians, you need kind of a stick to make sure that people will comply, because you're talking on behalf of millions of people.
We're moving on now to Mr. Shefke, please.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. And I also want to thank the ministers for being present here today. Mr. Champagne, I'd like to start with you this morning. Based on your experience working with our partners, our economic partners throughout the world, and the U.S. and Europe, could you maybe underline for the committee the importance of progressing with C26 in order to protect our businesses, but also the businesses with whom we have free trade and we're working with every day? Excellent question, Mr. Shifke, because we don't want to be the weak link in the chain. You know that there are specialists of intelligence and public safety who can tell you this. We never want to be perceived by state and non-state actors as being the weakest link in the chain. We would attract this kind of malicious action that can harm Canadian businesses or critical infrastructure systems. So I think that I always want to compare what's happening with the G7 and OECD to be among the best, as I think we can be the best. We need to have modern tools. I can say that when I saw that the Canadian Telecommunications Act did not have one of its goals being security, for me, that's a huge problem, because there is no jurisdiction in our allies anyway, where the Minister of Industry, or the person who's responsible for networks as important as telecommunications, that doesn't have security as an objective. It's essential today. We do need that. So the legislation that's being proposed will allow us to be equal to what our economic partners expect from us. And you're right, it's a definitive step in the right direction. Thank you, Minister.
Same question for you. I'm glad that you mentioned our Five Eyes partners. With the interconnectedness of our economy growing day by day, how important is it for Canada to do our part to advance our cybersecurity protection efforts, specifically with relation to C26?
Mr. Chair, through you, Mr. Schiffke, thank you for that question. This legislation is consistent with measures that are in place with our Five Eyes partners. As I said, we had a virtual meeting this week, the Five Eyes public safety ministers. This is always sort of a standing item. What can we do to deal with threats in the cyber security domain? The nature and the evolving threat landscape is such that I would suggest one country alone won't be able to have all of the good ideas and all of the best practices. That's why, as François Philippe said, the ability to work with G7 countries, particularly in the security context, our Five Eyes partners. MI5, MI6 in the UK have done a lot of research in this area. One of the things that obviously our American allies worry about is the rise of disinformation there in an election year. The chance that malicious state actors can either encrypt or paralyze cyber systems in the United States, insert disinformation and malware, the very basic tenets of a democracy are, as François Philippe said, reliant on a series of private sector and government actors in the basic transmission of information. So it's for in our perspective, the Government of Canada thinks that the adoption of this legislation will put us in a similar position to our five allies. And if we're not able to, in this Parliament, adopt this legislation, I think it would conversely send a signal to our allies, particularly the United States. I refer to that because the interconnectedness of our economy and industries that my colleague knows better than I do mean that basic services to Canadians that we rely on for daily life will be, in our view, subject to a threat that can be mitigated and can be contained.
Last question in the minute and a half that I have left, and it's for you, Minister Champagne. The bill is often talked about in terms of cybersecurity, but Part 1 is also very important. It's about creating authorities to secure the network, which has applications beyond cyber threats, including how we respond during natural disasters. It's important for my community of Vaudreuil-Soulanges, many others across the country, but in my particular case, last year when we had our ice storm in Quebec, I could not actually pick up the phone and call the mayors and my provincial counterparts to be able to coordinate a response to help support those that had no power and were stuck at home, seniors particularly. Can you speak to that and how important that is for us to be able to respond and better support Canadians in their time of need?
Yeah, I would say one word: resiliency. That's the purpose of this act, is to ensure resiliency of the telecom network in particular. And I can tell you, as you said, natural disasters come more frequently. They seem to be more violent, and they seem to come in different forms. And therefore, from forest fire to hailstorm we had in Quebec to floods in Atlantic Canada, we should not just look at this bill in terms of security, but also, I would say, when it comes to many of these, crucial network as resiliency. You would want a minister of industry, a future minister of industry, to have some power. Like I said last time, in light of that, we signed this memorandum of understanding because basically I gathered the CEO and I said, we need to do better. You need to do better to protect Canadians. We did it. But I think that it is wise, I would say, for a nation like Canada to have statutes in the book to be able to compel, not only relying on the goodwill of actors, which they did, because, like you said, people in times of needs, these systems become critical. When you can access the phone line and you're subject to a flood or another natural disaster, these powers would at least allow us to compel to take certain action. Obviously, it will be for the service provider to take these actions, but at least you would have kind of a power, not just a soft power to convene and ask. Then you could compel to do things.
Thank you, Mr. Champagne. Thank you. And now we're moving on to Ms. Michaud, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci, Messieurs les ministres.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, ministers, for being here with us this morning. It's highly appreciated. I would like to start by speaking of a text in the press saying then when Ottawa wants to manage everything that's happening. So it was in 2022 when this bill was tabled. It's been more than a year and a half. So we're thinking maybe it's not that cybersecurity is not a priority for the Canadian government. It was written by Ms. Stelia Pinto Moreira, an analyst at the Economic Institute in Montreal. Imagine an umpire at the Canadians game needs someone to explain how the puck can get to the net. That's not really part of their field of expertise, and that's what Ottawa's doing with Bill C-26. Rather than minding their own business, they want to get involved in digital security of businesses. So it says when a business finds a defect in their system, well, the company knows that they need to act very quickly. And otherwise, they're exposed to all kinds of major risks, legal risks and operational risks, etc. And she described the government, the Canadian government, is not acting quickly, mentioning the passport saga, and we remember that. That was quite a while ago. If we want to think of what's happening today, we can think of Phoenix, Canada, Arrive Canada, the border. So the governor was not very quick to deal with those issues. But so we can think that Canadian businesses are well prepared currently. They already are facing cybersecurity threats. In 2021, it was said that Canadian businesses invested more than $10 billion to prepare themselves for this kind of incident. So they're already doing the work. So concretely, in Canadian businesses, what will C-26 change? Thank you for this question, Ms. Michaud. And I would like to thank the colleague who wrote this article. So I'll give you one example that will show you why. Preventing harms is the role of the government. Remember, in the Rogers situation, there were 12 million Canadians who had no access to telecommunications services. They could not even make payments because they have connections with Interac. So the government acted very quickly. I talked to the Rogers CEO in the hours following, I think I was in Japan at the time, to ask him to take concrete action. And not only asking, you can say, well, Rogers is a huge business. They probably invest hundreds of millions of dollars in cybersecurity. But there were 12 million Canadians who didn't have any service for a long time. So I asked not only the CEO of Rogers, but all the CEOs to tell you, all of you have to assemble your teams to help Rogers. It's no longer a question of competition. It's an issue of Canadians that can't go to the grocery store, they can't buy gas. And then you're saying, well, there should be resilience in the system. That's where we realized in the hearings that followed this that there wasn't as much resilience or redundancy that we believed. So if you're the operator of an Interac system, well, you should have a backup system, a second system. But the incidents showed that it was necessary to improve things. So I think there is a role for the government to ensure public safety, public interest. But most businesses maybe do well, but Rogers is a huge company, and that's a good example where the government needed to add. And at the time, we acted in a voluntary way. I thank the businesses who accepted doing that. They even signed memorandum, and I thank them. But I think that in future, if there were a similar situation, we should have tools in our toolbox to say you did not do your work and Canadians are paying for it. So I know you can speak at length on a subject that you're passionate about, but we don't have much time. What I see is that we're giving a lot of powers to the government and the Minister of Industry. You seem to be trustworthy, and so if you do things secretly, well, it can go well. But some Canadians are concerned. There are issues of transparency. Could you explain why all of this has to happen in secrecy? And you can talk about Bell and Rogers, who can pay a fine of several $1 million from the government. But for a small Quebec SME, and you understand the importance of SMEs for Quebec economy, a small telecoms company with a few hundred clients. So what happens in that situation when such a company cannot create a plan that satisfies your requirements, and there'll be a fine? What does that mean for these SMEs, and what are the powers that you can exercise? So we look at the legislative summary. The Minister of Industry can make orders. So what does it mean? Well, thank you for your confidence. I appreciate that, but two things. So it is subjected to judicial review. Minister LeBlanc mentioned that earlier. And in judicial review, I can't be a lawyer here, but there's an issue of proportionality that's considered. And in terms of public safety, some of these directives have to be secret. For example, if we've identified a defect in the system, well, we don't want state and non-state actors to take advantage of this before that defect has been repaired. So publishing all the directives that we can make, well, there's a cyber attack, and we, especially for the 5G, things will be decentralized. So the weakest link in the chain will have been attacked. And I think it's in the best interest of the company, the organization of Canadians, that we could make a directive, issue a directive to, say, repair this. And after that, there will be feedback. But, you know, in our democracy, the problem is that state and non-state actors that want to harm a country, they're not playing with the same rules of the game as we are. So we'll say, well, listen, the weakest link of the country that we've just observed is such and such a system in such and such a telecom service. Well, so I'm inviting those people, before we've been able to repair that breach of the system, to come and interfere. I think we would be threatening the whole network. And so that's why we have to keep this information secret and confidential.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président, et merci à nos ministres.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, ministers, for your presence. You're always welcome here, and we would love to see you even more often, Mr. LeBlanc. So, my first question, you have stated so clearly in the beginning that this is an issue of national importance. We know that the number of cyber attacks increases constantly. And the government tabled this report in June 2022, and we're now moving at a glacial speed. It's 2024. This bill will be adopted. Why does the government not take this as a priority? We know that it's a monumental problem. Mr. Chair, thank you to my colleague and friend, Mr. Julian, for this question. I acknowledge that it has not moved as quickly as we would have wished. I understand you are also a parliamentary leader, and often the parliamentary process can be infected by other issues at times, but I'm not using that as an excuse. I acknowledge that we would have liked that this bill be adopted before 2024. I do not disagree with you. We're ready to do everything we can, including working with this committee on amendments to ensure that all the resources of our departments are available to help you to move forward in your work. But I know you're criticizing us in good faith. And I want to say that we are going to do our best. I have to remind you that I've been Minister of Public Safety since last July. Thank you.
Mr. John DeBoer from Blackberry testified that from September to December of last year, there were over 5.2 million cyber attacks. 62% of them targeted critical infrastructure. We heard from the Canadian Bankers Association. The number of priority one cyber attacks has tripled over the course of the past year. Is the government, is public safety, is industry tracking the number of cyber attacks across all sectors? Do you have that information available? Because to this date, we haven't been able to consolidate the number of attacks by sector. And in fact, in many cases, we've been told by witnesses that they simply don't gather those figures.
And Mr. Chair, thank you to Mr. Julian for identifying what we think is one of the positive elements of this legislation is the obligation to report. We take the good faith of many of these important private entities in working with the Government of Canada, but it probably isn't at the level to answer Peter's question that it needs to be at. That's why the positive obligation to report will ensure that we have reliable and accurate data on the alarming increase that our colleague identified. The Canadian Security Establishment, as I mentioned at the beginning, would be the federal agency that would be in a position to gather this data and share it across the government. The briefings I've had from public safety, from the director of CSIS and others, confirm that alarming trend. But Patrick, you may have details on how we're tracking or the Canadian Security Establishment is tracking. If you could briefly just provide Mr. Julian with that information.
Absolutely. Just to add to what Minister LeBlanc said, currently all reporting is done on a voluntary basis. And that's great when it happens. But obviously there's gaps in that. So part of this legislation as a foundational piece, as Minister LeBlanc said, is to make sure that we regularize that reporting so that CSC can take that information in, utilize the expertise that reside at CSC, and then propagate that back out to build resilience in other sectors.
Thank you, but that actually wasn't my question. I certainly understand how Bill C-26 attempts to correct that problem. What I'm saying is, what are the figures now? Do you have figures you can share with us, even if they've been reported on a voluntary basis, that indicate the extent and scope of cyber attacks to Canada?
We could definitely go back and talk to our partners at CSC, who are under the portfolio of DND, to see if there's some readily available information related to that.
That would be very helpful for the community.
And I'm happy to also, Mr. Chair, ensure that we get that information as quickly as possible and share it with the committee.
Thank you very much, Mr. LeBlanc. One of your other portfolios is foreign interference in our election process. I note, and we've been talking about the Communication Security Establishment, they flagged late last year that Russia and China's, and I think we can add to that allegations of India's cyber threat activity includes attempts to conduct attacks against election authority websites, accessing voter personal information or information relating to the election, and vulnerability scanning on online election systems. We've seen foreign interference have a dramatic impact in the United States, the election of Donald Trump, the Brexit referendum in the United Kingdom. In what way does C-26 reinforce our election system, our democracy, to protect against those cyber attacks that have had such a marked influence in other democracies?
So, Mr. Chair, I certainly share the concern that Mr. Julian has expressed. I think he's absolutely right. The risk, this is, as I noted, a U.S. election year, so those same actors who we understand had some success in 2016 will be at it again this year. Canadian election systems, one of the things, and this is a subject for another committee, maybe in Elections Act amendments that may come in the coming weeks, the fact that we have a paper ballot system is the director of the chief electoral officer says one of the best ways to secure our voting system. In my conversations with the chief electoral officer, we're obviously governed by his advice and his recommendations. I think where this might bump up this legislation into the important job of securing election systems is, for example, if the Elections Act were to allow people to apply online for a mail-in ballot, I'm just using one example off the top of my head, where those requests would go across the telecommunications channels that people have, the private businesses that my colleague referred to. That is not an Elections Canada system per se, but it's vital for people having access to democracy. So if we're working on making voting more accessible in 2024, 2025, it will necessarily involve the internet. It will necessarily involve telecommunication systems. The voting process per se is a paper ballot, but Elections Canada is very concerned about this. We've invested and we've allowed the Canadian Security Establishment to work with Elections Canada to strengthen their systems. And as my colleague would know, we've had the Government of Canada officials be available to political parties to help them secure their systems. But it is a source of concern that we share, and we're prepared to do more and everything we can in that regard.
Thank you so much. We're moving on down to the second round, and it's Mr. Lloyd, please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for coming today, ministers. Building resiliency for natural resources, natural disasters, building resilience against cybersecurity, these are things I think all Canadians and all parties can get behind. We know that there needs to be increased investment in cybersecurity and resiliency. But something that both ministers said today kind of gave me some pause when they referred to this bill as giving the government, in their words, emergency powers and extraordinary powers. And I think it's very concerning to Canadians to want to know, why does the government need, quote, emergency powers and extraordinary powers when we're really talking about trying to boost resiliency against natural disasters and trying to get companies to invest more in cybersecurity? Why does the government require legislation that gives them the power to conduct courts in secret, to announce legislation or block people from being part of the telecommunications sector in secret? Why are these emergency powers, why are they needed when what we need to do is get more investment in cybersecurity?
I'll be happy to respond to that. First, thank you to say this is not a partisan issue. I mean, I think, like you said, we're all trying to do the best thing. I'll give you a very concrete example. If we were to find that there's a breach, in 5G, you have to, I think everyone would agree that this is going to be very decentralized. When you go from 4G to 5G, it's a different world. We're not in the same kind of network because the future would be that you have intelligent products so that everything is interconnected. If we were to find that there is a failure or an intrusion in the network that could have a systemic effect in that, you would want the Minister of Industry in the future to be able to say, you stop or we disconnect that particular person or entity which is the source of the infection of the entire network, which could have a systemic effect. So the kind of power you need, you need to act very, very quickly because you're talking about...
But why do you need secret courts, Minister?
Well, I'll tell you, it's very simple. Because you would not want the actors, which are the ones who are trying to infiltrate our system, to be aware that you're asking them to plug the gap.
What are you going to put in to ensure that these powers are not abused? I mean, we've had lots of witnesses talk about how concerned they are about these powers, and you call them emergency powers.
People should
very concerning.
People should be equally concerned that today, imagine, the Minister of Industry doesn't have the power to ask that particular entity to plug, for example, that failure in their system that could have a systemic effect that could affect millions of Canadians. So I would say the check and balance in that, and I would say as a lawyer, you have judicial review, and under judicial review, you have proportionality, you have the Charters of Right and Freedom, all of these bills and legislation.
The Privacy Commissioner has stated that there isn't proportionality in this bill. What can we do to bring more proportionality to this bill?
Well, I would say under judicial review, as you know, it's well established in jurisprudence that you need to have proportionality in terms of the act of the government. But I think you should see it in a positive way. Imagine the reverse of not having the power, and you come to know that there's true 5G, that somewhere in the network, someone is infiltrating that could have a systemic effect that could be damaging both economically or millions of Canadians. I think about the reverse.
Thank you, Minister. I only have about a minute and a half left, but thank you for that. Minister LeBlanc, Canada has faced over the past few years a significant issue in that nearly 100 churches have been burned down or attacked in this country, most recently in Regina, the Blessed Sacrament Church. There were 4 churches leading up to Christmas in Alberta that were burned down. We haven't heard anything from you in your role as Public Safety Minister to denounce these attacks, and I just wanted to give you an opportunity today to assure the Canadian people and the Christian community and other communities of faith that you denounce these attacks against churches in Canada?
So, Mr. Chair, to Mr. Lloyd, thank you for the question. Of course, our government and I personally and all of us denounce what is an alarming increase of attacks against religious communities, against cultural communities. I talk to the RCMP commissioner often about what we can do as a national police force with local and provincial police to better protect communities, including the examples that our colleague identified. So we're concerned about an alarming rise in hate speech, in acts of hate crimes.
I appreciate
so I'm
that,
happy
Minister.
to
I do appreciate
join everybody
that,
in
Minister.
denouncing those particular
I am
incidents.
concerned, though, that departments under your control, such as CSIS, for example, they have not talked about this as this is a threat that we're facing across Canada. In some cases, I believe this rises to the threshold of terrorism. What are we doing to stop these terrorist acts against communities of faith in this country? What are you doing, Minister?
I'm working daily with the RCMP and other security partners to ensure they have the tools necessary to best protect Canadians. The decision around terrorism is properly in the hands, it's not a political decision, it's properly in the hands of prosecutors and investigators in national police forces and local police partners. But we recognize that the rising increase of hate crimes means that the RCMP in particular need to work with local police to understand the nature of that threat and ensure that local police forces and the RCMP in the case of transnational organized crime have all the tools they need to protect Canadians.
Thank you, Mr. LeBlanc. Mr. Lloyd, we're now moving on to Ms. O'Connell, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Ministers, for being here. We've heard a lot about privacy and privacy concerns, and we've heard that from witnesses, certainly. I think my colleague across the way misquoted the Privacy Commissioner, but there was a conscious effort in this legislation to provide foundational legislation here in C-26, and then the conscious effort to deal with some of the specifics through regulations. In the process of regulations and what the Privacy Commissioner spoke about is wanting to be involved in the development of those regulations to specifically address concerns of privacy and to specifically address details around SMEs, Indigenous communities who may need specific help and foundational work to be able to actually implement the goals of this objective. Can you speak to how regulations and the work with the Privacy Commissioner will be engaged to deal with privacy concerns?
Mr. Chair, thanks to Ms. O'Connell for that, I think, very good question. Obviously, nothing in this legislation affects the applicability of the Privacy Act. As I noted in my opening comments, if we can better help critical infrastructure sectors of the Canadian economy, things as important as banking and telecommunications companies, better secure their systems and help one another, help each other, obviously with the Government of Canada, the security establishment, the Canadian security establishment, better secure their systems. That is also a protection against the loss of privacy, of private information. And I remember my conversations with Premier Fury of Newfoundland and Labrador when some ransomware had been inserted and they had exported data from a health authority which covered 40 or 50% of the population of the province of Newfoundland and Labrador. So you can imagine the vulnerability that people in that province felt. It was resolved with the help of the Canadian security establishment. But that reminded me of the vulnerability. So if this legislation in some ways better incentivizes, it would be a polite word for it, compels is another word for it, partners, private sector partners, to do everything they have to do to secure the data. We think that's also important. But again, we would be happy to respond specifically to the question around amendments, Ms. O'Connell, to work with the Privacy Commissioner, to listen to other experts in this area. We respect and appreciate the application of the Charter of Rights, the Privacy Act, and other legislative measures that are important. And we think that this, done properly, this legislation is part of, in fact, improving and securing the private information of Canadians. But again, we would look forward to the deliberations of this committee and The Privacy Commissioner, of course, his views will be very important in us getting this balance right.
Thank you. It's also, Chair, it's also been suggested that there are somehow secret courts, and but when dealing with matters of national security, for example, even CSIS, with the CSIS Act, there are already legislation that all governments have actually used in terms of judicial reviews and the court process in dealing with national security. Does this legislation go beyond what already exists in Canadian law in terms of the protection of national security, but allowing the judicial process to ensure that no government overreaches past legislative authorities?
So, Mr. Chair, a good question from Ms. O'Connell. You served on NSI COP as well. You would see and be aware of some of these national security threats. You would also know, and you correctly referred to processes in the CSIS Act. I, as minister, signed, for example, CSIS warrants. They are appropriately reviewed by the Federal Court of Canada in the appropriate closed proceedings with amicus curiae there. I've been a member of Parliament for a while. Secret courts is a nice clip. It doesn't reflect something that's new or different, and the words are loaded to get a reaction. This is the appropriate balance that's no different than other legislation that Ms. O'Connell referred to, and is subject to judicial review, as obviously is appropriate. But Mr. Champagne wanted to add something briefly.
No, well, thank you. And Ms. O'Connell, it's a very, very good question. And I just want to rebase that also with the comments that were made by a colleague before. The power of the Minister of Industry, to quote, is to take action to promote the security of the Canadian telecommunications system. So when people say those are broad power, but with a very clear objective, they're not like very extended. It is to promote the security of the telecommunications system in Canada. So therefore, like I said, with supervision of the court, people, would look in judicial review. What was the objective? Was the action in line with the objective stated, which is the security of the network? And I think that is confining, kind of the powers that are given under the Act to act very quickly. It's with a very specific objective.
Thank you, Ms. O'Connell. Ms. Michaud, please, for 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Listen, Minister, I'll be frank with you, but I think you know this already. At the Bloc Québécois, what we like to do when there's a study of a bill is to make sure that the jurisdictions of the provinces in Quebec are respected. And C-26, there is a fear. Electricity Canada appeared before this committee and communicated this to us. Bill C-26 includes the electrical networks, and we can understand that through power lines, an organization such as Hydro-Quebec might be included, might be subject to this act, but maybe I'm mistaken, but Electricity Canada said that we would like certain amendments to be included here to avoid redundancy or in terms of the jurisdictions of provincial agencies. For example, if Hydro-Quebec, an organization which is the pride of Quebecers, does not comply with some ministerial orders, they might receive a financial penalty going up to $15 million. What would that what does C-26 represent for Hydro-Quebec, for example? Mr. Chair? Thank you, Madame Michaud, for the question. Hydro-Quebec is not only the pride of Quebecers, it should be the pride of all Canadians. I share her enthusiasm for this institution completely. It's very important for the country. I discussed this with the Quebec government minister responsible for cyber security. We had a good discussion, and he raised the preoccupations or the concerns just mentioned by Madame Michaud. We want to respect the jurisdiction of the Quebec government. The Act gives the Canadian government jurisdiction in certain sectors of the economy. We want to respect our own jurisdiction. In this context, you mentioned Hydro-Quebec, and there will be an intersection there. I believe that a collaborative effort with the Quebec government, who also shares the same goals as we have. I was impressed by the efforts of my counterpart in the Quebec governments for ensuring the security of critical systems in Quebec. Quebec is an example of the rest of Canada. We don't want to pick a fight with the Quebec government. We want to work in close collaboration, but we will also acquit ourselves of our national responsibility without taking anything away from the provincial governments. The institution, the security establishment of the Defense Department in cybersecurity is also a leader at the national level, and we have to share our knowledge and our skills with the other, with our counterparts.
Mr. Julian for 2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. A coalition of national groups, including the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, the Ligue des Droits et des Libertés, Privacy and Access Council of Canada, have been critical of the bill, but have also proposed some concrete solutions. One of those, given the fact that it is clear in their understanding that Bill C-26 would restrict applicants' access to evidence, is to create a special advocate to enable evidence to be tested in a court of law without being disclosed to outside parties. This recommendation, of course, comes from or borrows from the Immigration Act and the Refugee Protection Act. And so there's suggestion around a special advocate. I have two questions for you, Mr. LeBlanc. First off, why the government didn't consider creating that special advocate in the legislation initially, and does the government support now the idea of improving this legislation, which has some major weaknesses, by the creation of a special advocacy?
So, Mr. Chair, through you, we have taken note of that suggestion that Mr. Julian properly raises, and I think I'm by no means an expert in this area of national security law, but he referred to examples under the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act where these advocates are able to participate in these closed proceedings, access to all of the intelligence information appropriate. I know in the context of CSIS there are amicus curiae who can participate in these federal court hearings. So we would look favorably upon suggestions or amendments that this committee would want to make to ensure that we get that balance right. So there's certainly no principled objection from our part if in the wisdom of this committee that were an amendment that would be inserted that would, I hope, answer some of those very legitimate concerns. We would look favorably upon exactly that kind of démarche. Why it wasn't included in the beginning, I can't speak for that particular instance, but I'm more than happy to work with colleagues if that's deemed to be an oversight or something that can be corrected. Happy to accept the correction or the suggestion in a collaborative way.
Other testimony that we heard, thank you for that. Other testimony that we heard from Electricity Canada, and Mme. Michaud noted that just a few minutes ago, was the fact that there are different regulations around the NERC, the North American Cooperative of Energy, and what would be required in terms of C-26. And the recommendations from Electricity Canada was to ensure that there wasn't a doubling up of different regulations or different requirements. To what extent did the government consult with industry groups such as NERC over the course of the production of the bill? And is the government open to having more of a harmony between regulations that are already put in place by the industry groups and the provisions of C-26?
Julian, your time's up, please. I'm being more than generous, so I'm going to. But if you can.
Line, Chair, if we had a chance. But.
We can come. Mr. Julian will have another chance, please. Okay, we're moving to Mr. Lloyd, please, again.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Minister LeBlanc, through the Chair, Bill C-26 deals with cybersecurity. We know that the government's in-house IT capabilities are limited and that it's often dependent on contractors and consultants. We learned yesterday that GC Strategies has received $258 million from your government in contracts. Has this two-person IT company working out of their houses received any contracts from your department related to cybersecurity and measures in this bill?
Mr. Chair, through you to Mr. Lloyd, obviously, as we've said, There are serious concerns around this particular business. All contracts have been suspended with that business since last fall. There are internal audits and investigations going on at the Canadian Border Services Agency. I know that the Treasury Board and the Procurement Department are also looking at this. I'm not aware of specific contracts with this particular business that the Public Safety Department around IT security, cybersecurity. There are well-known elements with the Border Services Agency, but I'm happy to undertake to get that information to the committee. But all of that is part of these internal investigations that are ongoing. And of course, as we said, since if there is inappropriate behavior, it will face severe sanctions.
My follow-up question is, we know that CBSA has awarded this company 134 contracts. Are any of these contracts related to Canada's cybersecurity?
Again, I think the Border Services Agency clarified that number of contracts that our colleague is referring to, Mr. Chair, refer to amendments to actual contracts. The number is much lower than that. But again, this particular business's implication in cybersecurity, I'm happy to get back to the committee with a specific answer. That's obviously a concern we have. I'm not diminishing it, and that is subject to these internal investigations. I spoke with the president of the Border Services Agency as recently as this morning on this same suite of issues, but I'm happy to get back to the committee with that information.
Thank you. And that's a commitment from you, Minister, to get that information to this committee?
It is to understand the nature of where that particular business might have been working on cybersecurity issues.
Thank you. And my follow-up question to Minister Champagne, ISED has given GC Strategies 25 contracts, and have any of these contracts been awarded related to cybersecurity or provisions in C-26, or related to provisions in C-26?
I'd like to thank the colleague for the question. As Minister LeBlanc mentioned, there are internal investigation ongoing to assess exactly the nature of these contracts. And as Minister LeBlanc said, I'm happy to get back to the committee as we have to provide further details if any of them, like my colleague suggested, relate to anything with respect to cybersecurity. I suspect not, but we will confirm and get back to the committee.
Mr. Chair, we know national defense, there's been 6 contracts awarded to GC GC Strategies, and we know at Global Affairs there's been 12 contracts awarded. I don't expect you to know if those were also related to cybersecurity. Would you know?
I do not, but what I think Minister LeBlanc and I can commit to this committee is to ask our colleague to do exactly the same kind of procedure we will undertake, is to confirm to the committee.
Thank you.
I suspect not, but again, we will get back and endeavor to get back to the committee.
I'd like to give the rest of my time to Mr. Motz. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Chair. The National Security Strategy, or National Strategy for Critical Infrastructure, lists 10 actual areas that are critical to the security of our infrastructure, and yet this bill only talks about 5 or 6 of them. Is there a reason we've left out health and food, water, manufacturing, those sort of things out of this bill, which are critically important to the sustaining of the safety of Canadians? Any thoughts to that?
Mr. Chair, through you to Mr. Motz, obviously this legislation can only apply to federally regulated sectors. We as a government want to collaborate with partners in provinces and territories that, for example, would manage health systems. I identified that as a vulnerability. We can't legislate in that particular area. We would seek to sign agreements where possible with other partners.
Minister, so what efforts have you or Mr. Champagne undertaken with provinces, with territories, with municipal governments, First Nations governments, to deal with these issues that are critically important so that they too are adequately secured from a cyber perspective in this space?
And that's a very good question that you're asking. And as Minister LeBlanc, we are in consultation with them. I would say that those that we have identified are also the backbone, because you could say, for example, the telecom system is an enabler to a lot of these other sectors of the economy. So we have targeted initially those which are providing systemic, I would say, sustainment to some other field, because you could say, at the end of the day, cybersecurity, I would say, could cover a very wide area because, like I said, Canadians are impacted, SMEs are impacted, but those that we have targeted in federal jurisdictions are kind of the backbone. But like as Minister LeBlanc said, we are in discussion to see how we can do that, and certainly are always looking to make sure that every sector that could be impacted by cybersecurity would have adequate protection.
Mr. Gahir, please.
Great. Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the ministers for appearing before the committee. My first question is for Minister LeBlanc, through you, Chair. We know that the legislation introduces a mandatory reporting requirement for critical infrastructure operators in the different industries. Mr. Julian touched on this point. Electricity Canada raised the point that if industry or a company is going through a cybersecurity attack, then mandatory reporting requirements, specifically immediate reporting requirements, could be cumbersome. Could you speak to why mandatory as opposed to voluntary reporting requirements are important?
Mr. Chair, through you, Mr. Gahir, thank you for that question. And you're right, this would set up a system, a regime of mandatory reporting. Precisely, and we recognize that it is a burden or it is a circumstance that we're imposing on private businesses. But for the reasons my colleague identified, they are increasingly the backbone of basic services that Canadians rely upon for the Canadian economy, for the safety and security of people in their homes, driving their cars. So we think that the balance of, while many will want to voluntarily report, the obligation to have mandatory reporting will, to Mr. Julian's point, give us data on exactly the nature and the number of these threats, but will allow us to work with other businesses to better protect them as a particular defect is identified or a particular threat or activity is successful. The objective will be to quickly work with other players in that sector or similar sectors to ensure that they have the best resiliency and the best protection possible. But Mr. Champagne had something he wanted to add to that.
Well, I would like to say to colleagues of the committee, think about the interconnectivity of that. I would say when some telecom network have gone down in case of natural disaster, they were related to power outage. So I think you cannot look at that at silos, and I think that's what the comments were related, is taking a systemic view, because, for example, if you had an attack on one system in the electricity network, that could well have an impact then on the telecom network, because without power and backup power, we may not be able to continue to function on the telecom network. So I think that's why you see this information and us to be able to act very quickly to prevent, a more systemic damage to interconnected network. Like I said, when you look at telecom, look at power, they are very connected. I can tell you, in all disasters that we had, particularly in Eastern Canada, when I talked to premiers, one of the things they were mentioning is always about power, because without power, the towers are not operating, even with backup power. So I would say that if we saw an attack, a cyber attack on the electric grid, we would want to know very quickly what that could have as an impact on the telecom network as well. And think about the 5G with the Internet of Things. If you have an attack on power, that could have a spillover effect in so many other ways. Colleagues were mentioning health, hospital functioning, equipment in hospitals. You have to really, this is like a systemic view of how to protect Canadians.
Great. Thank you. So during the course of this committee, we've heard a lot about the transparency of the powers that are included in this bill and the use of those powers. Would the government be open to some sort of reporting of the number of orders that are issued under this bill for transparency while protecting security details?
If I can, Mr. Chair, that again is a good suggestion. We'd want to take the advice from the chief of the Canadian Security Establishment or the director of CSIS or other senior officials who have, in many cases under law, the responsibility to protect this information. This is a discussion that we're having with the Foreign Interference Judicial Inquiry. What's the best way to share with Canadians the nature of the threat of foreign interference? To use a similar example, cyber attacks, many of them originating by foreign state actors, hostile state actors, might be a similar context. The necessity to protect this information is precisely not to enable other hostile actors to have a nice roadmap into how to infect an electricity delivery system in the city of Montreal or a healthcare system in some other province. I have confidence in the officials that will do this work to respect the Charter of Rights, to respect the Privacy Act. But again, if this committee, and happy to make officials available to work with you to understand the nature of that reporting requirement, but if there was sort of an aggregate report that X number of orders were issued in a particular year, and I would be happy to work with the committee, but I'm not an expert, because there's something called the mosaic effect, which I've learned from the director of CSIS. Sometimes if you release certain pieces of information, it appears innocuous in one particular context, but a hostile state actor who may be deciding to do something very dangerous to Canadians is in a position to piece together various pieces of public information and come to a conclusion, even if it's the wrong conclusion. So they may not necessarily be bound by the responsibility to get to beyond a reasonable doubt. I just want to make sure that it's not interconnected and we're not committing to something that would be dangerous, but happy to work with the committee.
Thank you. And we're moving now to the third round, and the times will be reduced to 4, 4, 2, and 2. And we're starting with Mr. Motz, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. Ministers, again, we understand that there's, we've heard from various witnesses here at committee through the written submissions that there's many flaws with this bill, that it was, written and tabled here, and, with overreach, lack of accountability and transparency. And so, did you consult others on this bill? Obviously, it appears maybe that you didn't listen to the consultations. That's a...
Well, as far, there was a wide consultation, and I would say, Mr. Moss, think about the danger of inaction as well. I mean, I respect the views of everyone, but the threat that we've been talking about, our telecom sector, the energy sector, financial services, transportation, I think that having the power, as if you look at our peer in the world, I think it's the responsible thing to do for Canadians to have these power. Like I said, in the telecom sector, and you will recall, we've been able to get a voluntary commitment, but I think Canadians watching at home would want to make sure that government would have power to compel the right thing to do to protect systemic failure that could happen throughout different networks.
Thank you, Minister. I apologize. I'm going to turn my time over to Mr. Lloyd for the remainder. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Auditor General has made some damning revelations about cybersecurity in her recent ArriveCAN report related to your department. Quote, there were deficiencies in the testing of the ArriveCAN application cybersecurity testing completed by resources that were not security cleared or identified on task authorizations. The Auditor General further found that some of the resources that were involved in the security assessments did not have the proper security clearance. Minister, how can we be assured that your government has the security of Canadians at their highest priority when companies that are being contracted to provide cybersecurity on your priorities are not even being cleared for security clearance? How can you guarantee to Canadians that none of their personal information using the ArriveCAN app was not compromised by these companies that did not have security clearance?
So, Mr. Chair, through you, we obviously were concerned with those Auditor General findings. My discussions with the President of the Border Services Agency have reassured me that she, before the Auditor General's report, as you know, the procurement ombudsperson also looked at this, has put into place a series of measures that will not allow that circumstance to happen.
And I appreciate that going forward, Minister, but can you guarantee that Canadians' personal information was not compromised by these companies that did not have security classifications to provide cybersecurity testing on the ArriveCAN app? Can you tell Canadians that their information was not compromised?
What I can tell Canadians is that our government and organizations like the Canadian Security Establishment, which would have sort of an overarching responsibility around the protection of federal IT systems, are very effective at doing everything we possibly can to protect all systems that would contain the data, personal data of Canadians. None of this work is perfect, and that's precisely why We work with allies around the world, the Five Eyes. That's precisely why this mandatory reporting will be an important
Minister,
element of that.
are you investigating whether this possible information was compromised? Is there any investigation by your department ongoing into whether that information was compromised?
All of the circumstances around the ArriveCAN app and the development of that and the role of some private contractors is being investigated. And as I say, I have every confidence that those incidents identified by the Auditor General have been corrected. Reminding the committee that in the context of those first months of COVID, there was across governments, across the country, provincial governments, I was the Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs, a rush to do what was necessary.
There's no excuse when Canadians' private
This is-
information is put
thank
at
you.
risk. No excuse.
Please, okay, that's fine. Thank you so much. We're moving on to Mr. Biddle, please, for 4 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. And Minister LeBlanc, Mr. Mott's brought up the provincially regulated industries and the importance they are to the security landscape. I was wondering if you could comment a little bit more about that, about the role of the federal government with respect to this, and whether there is an opportunity to amend the legislation to highlight the role of the provinces in regards to protecting Canadians in this in provincially regulated industries.
Mr. Chair, through you to Mr. Biddle, thank you for that question, because it's very much at the heart of the exercise that I think all of us are trying to achieve in Bill C-26. Our particular federation gives our partners in provinces and territories jurisdiction over things as important as healthcare systems, as infrastructure, highway infrastructure within a province or territory, and we're all thinking of examples where these particular critical infrastructure sectors can be subject to these cyber attacks. I've spoken to mayors of cities, St. John, New Brunswick, it was reported, was a small Canadian city, subject to pretty concerning cyber attacks. So the only way we're able to do that work is in partnership with provinces and territories. And of course, they are responsible in the case of municipalities as well. So we would be wide open to signing agreements with provinces and territories. We think that C-26, if it's adopted and receives royal assent, can be a model for some other provincial legislation that should be, I would suggest, companion pieces to this federal legislation. But as colleagues would want, we're always looking to respect provincial jurisdiction and les compétences des provinces. C'est sûr que c'est une priorité pour nous.
We know that that's important, but we won't abandon the need to be a leading-edge partner. We will not share data unless it's safe. That's why we will sign agreements with the provinces about sharing data. So we understand that there is a provincial jurisdiction. I use the example of Newfoundland and Labrador. It's when the Prime Minister there told us that we're completely overwhelmed in terms of capacity. Can the Canadian government intervene? And so we did what we could at that point to help them resolve that situation.
Answer the question, but this bill is one piece of Canada's effort to improve cyber security. Can you comment on the pressing need to ensure we have programs and legislation in place to keep Canadians' information and critical infrastructure secure, and what, if anything, else we're doing on that front?
We've been, actually, when I was going back, we've been doing a lot. I mean, the work of this government has been starting back to 2013 with the establishment of the Security Review Program. And then I saw in 2018, we released the National Cyber Security Strategy. 2019, you've seen significant investment north of $100 million to develop a critical cyber systems framework. And in 2021, we did that study, the Interdepartmental 5G Security Examination. And I would say very, very compelling is that in May of 2022, we indicated very clearly that there will be no longer Huawei and ZTE equipment in one of our most important network, which is the telecom network in this country. So I think you've seen that every step of the way with the Ministry of Public Safety, we have been trying to be ahead of the game because in matter of cybersecurity, malicious actor will always try to catch up one way or the other. So working with our 5G partner, Five Eyes partner, working with our G7 partner, working with allies around the world to make sure we identify the threat, we disrupt these malicious actors, and protect our critical network. But I would say the piece that we have in front of us is essential, I would say, for Canadian businesses, for the sectors that are being, protected in particular. And I would come back again, the telecom network is one of those because with the Internet of Things and 5G, this is going to be everywhere. And therefore, that's why it's so important, the work of the committee today.
Riddle. We're moving to Ms. Michaud, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. One of the issues that came up very frequently during our consultations was the issue of transparency, but also the concept of privacy. So the privacy commissioner told us that it might be a good idea that the government consults us before taking any decision in the matter of C-26 in order to reassure Quebecers and Canadians. C-26 does not provide for a time between the time when the government has access to private information and then deletes them. So we know that the government is not protected against leakage of data. So how do we balance privacy and transparency? And also with these orders that are put out in secrecy. So what can we do to reassure Canadians? The powers that are granted are there to ensure the security of designated systems. So the goal is very clear. It's security. I would say that in a cyber attack, that could have a systemic effect on many entire sectors, either telecommunications or banking or transportation systems. There is an urgency to act. I can tell you that when there are natural disasters, I don't want to come back and talk about Rogers too often, but when there were 12 million Canadians who did not have access to payment systems in the country, it was urgent that we act. So we have to find the right equilibrium. I understand this desire to consult, but an attack in case of 5G, that could have an effect on all systems. So to publish a defect in one actor's system could invite other malicious attacks on that system. But yes, there is administrative law that applies. There is judicial review. There's the Charter of Rights and Freedoms also.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Le rapport.
Thank you, Chair. The Auditor General's report on ArriveCan speaks actually of this poor treatment of confidential information.
And talks about the mishandling of confidential information. And so this is something that we need to learn from. In C-26. We've had testimony from Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto. One of the recommendations is that relief should be available if government mishandles confidential, personal, or de-identified information. Amending this legislation to enable individuals and telecommunications providers to seek relief if the government has mishandled that information. And I'll direct this question to Mr. LeBlanc. Do you believe that it's appropriate that we incorporate into that legislation lessons learned from ArriveCan?
Mr. Chair, absolutely. Because like all colleagues, and I think all Canadians that have taken notice of the Auditor General's findings and other internal review processes that I have been briefed on before the Auditor General's report, makes me think that this is an opportunity to avoid exactly some of those concerns. We have explained the context in which these things were developed. It no way justifies the financial circumstances around that, or perhaps more importantly, the protection of the personal information of Canadians. So if the committee has suggestions around an appropriate way to ensure that there is a positive obligation on the Government of Canada to ensure that those circumstances identified by the Auditor General are never repeated, we would welcome exactly that kind of work.
We've also had recommendations to prohibit the disclosure of personal or de-identified information to foreign organizations. This comes from the coalition. Is this a recommendation you support?
I had, Mr. Chair, I had also taken note of that recommendation. I would want to hear from some of the heads of our security agencies, the director of CSIS or the Canadian Security Establishment. As we said in a number of answers to colleagues' questions, the ability to effectively partner with allies, particularly the United States in this context. They have amongst the most sophisticated cyber defense systems in the world. So we need to learn from them. That does not mean that we're callous or we mishandle the personal information of Canadians. It would have to be subject to applicable laws, the Charter of Rights. So I would, if the committee wants to look at that, I would make available, the committee will make its own decisions in terms of amendments, of course. I am not an expert in what is the appropriate balance of sharing with foreign partners. I think we have to allow some of that, but we have to ensure that it's encadré, the right protections are there for the private data of Canadians. But I think if we're going to do this effort successfully in terms of securing critical infrastructure and the private, it comes full circle because to some extent we're also securing the private data of Canadians that is held by private sector actors right now. If I think of what my bank would have in terms of financial information on me or on all of us, they take that very seriously, of course, but is there a way for the Government of Canada to partner with them? So it comes full circle, but I think I'm looking at Mr. Julian, whom I've known for a long time. He will be concerned about the balance in that work, as am I, and if the committee wants to find the right way to ensure we get that balance, I'd be happy to work with the committee and make sure that experts that may have views much more informed than my own would be able to provide that perspective.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Julian. And before we suspend, if you can bear with us, witnesses, I appreciate you guys coming in here today and with your teams. I just want to ask the committee, up next we do have witnesses that some of them we've already seen in a technical briefing and asked questions to. If you feel that we've had enough questions relevant to this today with the ministers, I would ask for unanimous to consent because we do have some committee business that the clerk needs to be verified from us as a committee. So if I have unanimous consent, I will allow the ministers and the witnesses, the next witnesses, to leave, and we could do our committee business and move on. Is everybody okay with that? Okay.
Mr. Chair.
Yes.
I'd like to just get one quick round with the witnesses.
You would?
Yeah.
So, okay.
And then we can move on to committee business quickly.
Okay, so, all right, we'll suspend for 5 minutes. Thank you. Thank you again. I would like to welcome the additional officials who have joined us. And just those in the back, if they could keep the noise down. Department of Industry, Juan Kwan, Senior Director, Spectrum and Telecommunications Sector. Andre Arber, Director General, Strategy and Innovation Policy Sector. What we're going to do is we're going to modify our time here. We're going to go to about 3 minutes each, if we can. If we need to shorten it up, I will. So I will start with Mr. Lloyd, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll keep this really quick. Thank you, officials, for coming. There's been some concern by some of the witnesses that this legislation, while increasing costs to prevent cyber attacks and preserve their cyber infrastructure, that there will be a drastic increase in compliance costs. And if you know what the estimated increase in compliance costs for all the industries affected by this bill will be, can you tell this committee today? And if not, I'd like to get a commitment that you would be able to send that information to this committee before we start our clause by clause. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Of course, I think there's still a lot of work to be done yet through the regulatory process, and that's something that is, I think, foundational to this bill moving forward. So I think there's more work to be done.
But you don't have that answer right now.
But I will say that the cost of breaches to cyber systems.
I understand. I just want to know what those estimated costs are.
Mr.
I've got
Chair.
2 minutes, Mr. Chair.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. In all fairness, it's at this committee, the questioner asks the question, and you give a chance for the witness to answer.
Mr.
It's not right to cut.
Mr. Lloyd.
A yes or no question doesn't require that much time. Mr. Chair, sorry, and thank you. And the witnesses, I'd also like if you could provide this committee with information on any estimates on the increase or the net increase in full-time equivalents that the government would possibly need to hire in order to administer the provisions under this legislation. Do you have that information on you now? And if not, can you commit to this committee to get us that information? Thank you.
Again, I think there's an extensive regulatory process that will be done in partnership with not only industry, but provinces and territories to further flesh this out, identify thresholds on how this act will apply to them. So this is a real partnership approach that we're taking here with stakeholders and with partners. And those are some of the details that we're going to have to work together with partners to
Can you get those estimates to us at least? Do you not have economic modeling on what the red tape impacts, GDP impacts? Do you have any of that modeling, and can you share that with this committee?
There's no red tape impact being anticipated for implementation of this bill. This is about working with industry.
There's no increase in compliance costs from this legislation?
This is about working with industry to make sure that we're protecting critical infrastructure that Canadians rely on a daily basis.
Mr. McKinnon, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here. So we've heard from witnesses who allege that this bill will result in government accessing, collecting, and most particularly misusing personal information, including personal cell phone information. Is that likely to happen? And why or why not? And I would ask Mr. Schwan.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, pour la question.
Thank you, Chair, for the question.
Protection of personal information, as noted in C-26, the minister has order-making powers that will allow him to be able to issue orders to protect the security of the telecommunications system. Two things that I think are really important to note is that the actions and orders related to the minister's ordering-making power have to be connected to that security objective and are ring-fenced by that in that regard. Similarly, there's a proportionality test that applies as a function of administrative law to the orders that the minister is making. Two things that I think are really important as well to note is, one, that the Privacy Act continues to apply both to the Minister of Industry and to his officials through the department, and that the Personal Information and Protection of Electronic Documents Act, or PIPEDA, continues to apply to the telecommunications providers for whom order making would be done. And so there are privacy protections in place on both entities, both the government side and the private sector side, and there are limitations to the order making capacities of the minister.
Thank you. We've heard a lot about protecting our infrastructure from malicious actors, but we also heard of the need to protect ourselves from natural disasters and so forth. forest fires and floods and whatnot. Can you tell us how this bill might facilitate that effort?
I'm happy to start, Monsieur le Président, pour la question.
Thank you, Chair, for the question.
Important to note that the telecommunications security objective, as the Minister outlined, actually allows for a broad reach of application in the sense that security is fundamental to a number of contexts. And while we often think about that as related to cyber, in this particular zone, I think we need to think about security as things like, can you securely access the telecommunications system in the event of natural disasters, which are increasingly common? And so the Minister of Industry has order-making powers under C-26, for instance, to allow for a telecommunications service provider to develop a security plan in relations to its secure services, networks, or facilities. Thank you.
Appreciate it.
There's a
Thank you,
number
Mr.
of
McKinnon. Ms. Michaud, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. I think that the people who are here have briefed their respective ministers very well. My questions have all been answered, so I would like to let my time go because I would like to talk about the time we'll have to file our amendments.
Thanks for being here. I asked the question earlier about NERC and the corresponding regulations of North American Electrical Reliability Corporation. To what extent are the ministries reaching out to vital infrastructure associations like that to ensure that we are not ending up in a compliance issue around the legislation and regulations that mean that a company or an entity might be pulled in two different directions?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. Through the development of this bill, there's been extremely extensive engagement with associations like the one that you're referencing, and that will continue through the regulatory process in establishing those regulations. We also want to ensure that we're engaging with provinces and territories to ensure that industry, possible entities that are subject to, for example, federal legislation like this and provincial legislation, that there's harmonization within the implementation of those various laws. So that's a commitment, I think, that is foundational to this bill and something that we're going to continue to do through further engagement.
When you say harmonization, are you suggesting then that the legislation or the anticipated regulations are being changed to some extent to ensure that there isn't that duplication or contradiction between two different directions to assure cybersecurity, or is the intent of the harmonization to get the other organizations to change their rules? Because that's two very different approaches.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think it's to ensure that there is that harmonization, the first aspect that you touched on, making sure that they're not contradictory to each other, that these organizations aren't being pulled in two different directions. So again, this is more engagement that we want to do with provinces. It's something that we've committed through our engagement to date with provinces and territories and with industry to make sure that through the regulatory process that we get it right for industry.
One of the aspects of the legislation is immediate notification around cyber attacks, and there have been, I think, strong suggestions from a number of witnesses that there needs to be a clear period. Some are suggesting a 72-hour notification period, the objective being to respond to the cyber attack, to hopefully stop the cyber attack initially, and that the reporting requirements, the notification requirements, become onerous if you're not able to handle the attack, if you're not fighting back against the attack. If you're spending more time being concerned about following the letter of the law rather than responding to the cyber attack, this can be a real difficulty. So how does the ministry define immediate notification? And do you agree with what numerous witnesses have said, that what we need is a clear period, but one that allows the organization, the company, the entity to stop the cyber attack first before they have to engage in a notification to...
I absolutely can, Mr. Chair. I think it's a great question, and yes, I would agree that there needs to be a clear period for reporting. This is something that we've discussed through engagement to date, and something that we want to identify through further engagement as we establish that through the regulatory process. Again, balancing, Mr. Julian, the need for making sure that we're aware of the threat, so that we could apply the expertise that we have at the CSC, but also to warn other sectors to be able to build resilience measures within their own infrastructure, while also considering the realities that you just elaborated on. So absolutely, I think we're going to have to be clear on that, and that's something that we're committed to working with partners to establish.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Julian. Before we go any further, we have some administrative housekeeping that the clerk would like to get some answers on, so I'm going to... You guys can disperse. That's fine. Thank you so much. So, committee, if the committee wish, and we talked a little bit about this our last meeting, if the committee wished to start clause by clause consideration of Bill C-26 on Monday, February 26, 24, I recommend to establish the deadline for submitting amendments to Wednesday, February 21st at noon. And I know there was some conversation surrounding this, so I'll ask if that's still okay. Yes, Mr. Shipley.
My first, sorry?
Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Chair. After the study we've just done and the hearing, what we've heard today, there is, I believe, a fair number of amendments coming forward. I think next Wednesday is going to be a little tight to get those in. If we can maybe bump those back to the Wednesday when we're back, if that gives us next week. And we don't have as many resources as the government side. Everybody knows that. So we're going to try to get ours in too, but an extra week would, I think, be helpful.
Ms. Michaud.
Merci. Mon comment.
So my comment is in the same vein. We have rather limited resources, and it's a quite demanding exercise to prepare the amendments to make sure that everything is in compliance. So there's a lot of back and forth. So 21st of February, less than a week, gives us very little time. In addition, if we look at, we would be starting the study of the bill in the following week, and then we have a break for another 2 weeks. So I think we would have to rush to do the work, and then the study of the bill will be paused because there are many writing weeks in March. So I think an extra week, as proposed by Mr. Shipley, seems reasonable to me. And for the committee meetings, we could take advantage to begin the car theft study.
Moi, je suis d'accord avec mes collègues. D'une part, on pourrait...
I agree with my colleagues. On the one hand, we could start in 2 weeks, in a week and a half, start the study on car theft, and in that way we could submit our possible witnesses for the end of next week or by Thursday. So maybe for Monday or Tuesday, submit our list of witnesses. And then have these witnesses for the car theft study, as Ms. Michaud suggested, and then have a deadline the following week for amendments. But I would like to propose that for the following week, because we just have 2 weeks of sittings in 7 weeks. So if we deal with the car theft next week, I would like to propose that we have longer sessions for C-26. I find it very difficult to do 2 hours where we're studying amendments and then we come back 3 days later and do just a few amendments. So to possibly have Monday from 3:30 to midnight to go through all the amendments, I find that much more useful. So I find it much better to do these things in a concentrated way. We could maybe finish with the bill that week, the second week of the sittings in March. That's what I would like to propose, that we have longer meetings and that we have a later deadline for tabling the amendments and that we carry out the study. I know that Madame Michaud and the Conservatives agree with this, that we would deal with car theft for the 2 meetings next week. And
Understand and appreciate the need for a little bit of extra time. I would hate to lose both meetings in our next week here. So we have the 26th and 29th. If we want to start auto theft on the 26th, that's fine and allow for amendments, but I wouldn't suggest that we lose the 28th as well, because keeping in mind there's only one sitting week in March, and one of those meetings we've already confirmed, the 21st, is with the minister on his mandate. So that's essentially leaving us with 2 meetings if we're looking at February 28th and March 18th. And as we've heard from testimony even today, the threat is incredibly real, that this bill, everybody has agreed, is urgent. So I would agree with Mr. Julian that having later sittings we would support, but I would suggest that amendments be in by the 26th of February, and that would allow the start of clause by clause on February 28th. And we could still start auto theft on the 26th for that specific meeting. And that's a compromise in terms of extending amendment dates, but not losing both meetings in February. And then I would also suggest extended sittings.
Mr. Shipley?
Thank you. There's a lot of discussions going on about different dates now. I think we need to get it clarified just a little bit. So we're going to put off doing the amendments for an extra week, and then when we come back on the Monday, we're going to start the auto theft? Is that what I'm hearing, Ms. O'Connell? And then the Thursday of that week will be into what? I'm sorry? Clause by clause? So proceeding after that, then, would we go every other meeting like we had talked about, doing auto theft? And
That motion wasn't carried, and I think we finished clause by clause, as we would only have 2 sittings, and I would take Mr. Julian's point that we extend the 2 days that we have, and then we would proceed, once clause by clause is finished, we proceed with continuing on auto theft.
well, thank you for that. The only issue is on some of those days, some of our members do sit on more than one committee, and they'd have other committee work that night, so I don't know if that would fall into
Guess we couldn't extend Thursdays.
What I find rather interesting is this has been on the books since June of 2022. So we're 20 months into this, and now we want to rush through a process that we've heard many witnesses, and we have significant recommendations to make on a clause by clause to go through and fix this, and that's the responsibility of this committee to do. I don't know why the rush of an extra day or a week or two to go through this, that we sit. I don't support the extra length of meetings. We have other responsibilities as well, and so I definitely don't support the need to sit extra. I think we should get at the study on auto, and when we're done with our recommendations and have them submitted, then we can go back and work on the clause by clause of C26, but that, for sure is going to take a lot longer than a couple of meetings extended time.
Mr.
Obviously
McKinnon.
not. You guys sat on it
Mr.
since
McKinnon?
June of 2022.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I certainly agree with Ms. O'Connell, and I support the extended settings when we get to it. I certainly, Mr. Mott's concern that this bill has been tabled since June of 22. We should remember that it came to this committee in March of 23, so we've had it for a year, just about. So any delay to this bill is really on us, not on the government. It's a very important bill. We need to get going on it. That's why the extended sittings are critically important. It's not a matter of just delaying another week, because we're going to lose most of March, right? I think once we start this bill, clause by clause, we should do it as soon as we can, in keeping with Ms. O'Connell's suggestion. we need to take every meeting we can to proceed with it. So, thank you.
Julian, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will say, in reaction to Mr. Motz's comments about having other things to do, I mean, every NDP MP, and I think it's the same with the bloc, we have like 4 hats we have to wear. So if we could find time to come here, I think Conservatives should be able to as well. If what I'm hearing from my Conservative colleagues is that they are going to try to slow down or block the bill, that is different than if we have good faith on all sides to actually proceed through. And to have, for example, a meeting from 3:30 to midnight on Monday, when we come back that second week, we should actually be able to make real progress if there's good faith on all sides. To improve the bill, of course, but there is a difference between having an extended hearing with a filibuster and having an extended hearing where we are working through systematically the amendments. We all agree this bill has to be improved. I think in good faith we can do that the second week back. That would allow this first week back to be focused on auto theft. And if we have agreement on extended hearings on that second week, I don't think any party would object to doing 2 hearings on auto theft the week after next. But if we don't have the agreement around extended hearings in that second week, then I think it becomes more problematic the first week. So if we're all working together to get this bill improved and through committee and back to the House, then I think we have a game plan, 2 meetings on auto theft the week after next, a deadline for amendments the following week, and then when we come back, we have extended hearings, including potentially an extra meeting on Tuesday night that allows us to work through the amendments.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Michaud, please.
Merci. Je voudrais juste peut-être...
Thank you. Maybe we can recapitulate the specific dates. I don't think it's a bad idea to have extended hours. However, until midnight, that seems a little rough. So maybe 4 hours, 5 hours, maybe Monday evening from 4:30 to 8:30 or 9:30. That I have no problem with that. So now we're saying, and you can confirm, Chair. So we sent in our amendments by February 26th, and the 26th February meeting would be on auto theft. The following Thursday, we would begin our study of C26, and the clerk will have already given us the amendments from other parties because we have to take time to study those. So we would begin the study then. Given that it's Thursday morning, we can't really prolong that meeting. So 2 weeks later, we are Monday, March 18th. And I imagine that meeting would be extended. And on the Thursday, we have Mr. Leblanc. So for C26, next meeting would be in April 8th.
You mentioned to me that on the 26th, amendments would have to be in by noon. Okay. Mr. Shipley, please.
Thank you, Chair. And again, there's been a lot of dates. Mr. Julian, I think you had a good solution. I hope that this is what you said. If not, correct me, please. When we return that first week back, we would do auto theft on the Monday and the Thursday, and then when we return after that, we could do the extended seatings. Is that? Because I think we can agree to that.
I think it's quid pro quo. If there is agreement for extended hearings on to go through the amendments, well, Monday, potentially Tuesday, when we get back, then I think everyone would be in agreement with having auto theft for those 2 days.
So, Chair, sorry, just to sort of recap. We're riding week next week, the first week back. That week, both meetings would be auto theft. And then when we return after that, we do extended sittings for C26. Is that what I'm hearing, Mr. Julian? Did that?
That's what I'm proposing.
And I think that's a good compromise. We would agree with that, Mr. Julian.
With the understanding that the Monday that we're back.
Ms. O'Connell, please.
Mr. Chair, I recognize the fact that there also needs to be time to review amendments, but if there are available hours, even in that February 26th week, why wouldn't we ask for additional hours? We could still do auto theft in our regular meetings, but additionally ask for additional hours if available. We can do two things at once.
From the chair,
So
I'll
leave it with you to figure
I'll
out.
say, we'll do our magic, Mr. Clerk.
I'm somewhat concerned about your magic.
Well, okay, maybe that was a point.
I think there's kind of an understanding, at least from the majority of the committee, that we want to do 2 auto theft studies days next week, and that we would start using extended hours in March on C26. That's my understanding. I just don't want to get surprised when the notice comes out, Mr. Chair, and we've got a huge extended February meeting coming out of nowhere when this committee doesn't, not very clear that we've agreed on that.
I think the chair heard everybody's opinions, and we will take it into consideration when I sit down with the clerk.
As you know, when we don't feel like we're consulted or listened to, we have the penchant to, act in certain ways. And
that's your prerogative.
That's hard to believe. Mr. Chair?
So, yes.
One thing we need to consider in our deliberations is that the legislative clerk will need time to go through the amendments, and, I think he'll need a couple days probably.
Okay. Mr. Shipley, please.
Thank you, Chair. Just quickly, since we're talking a little bit about the auto theft, we just hadn't discussed which ministers would be attending for those hearings. We would just like to suggest that the Justice Minister, the Public Safety Minister, and the Minister of Transportation could all be invited if everybody on the committee agrees that those 3 ministers would be important to hear from on this important issue. Well, if we didn't want to, I thought everybody would probably agree with that, Chair.
You are so optimistic, Doug.
We can invite ministers, but we don't necessarily know they're available, right?
Please have your comments through the chair so we don't get. Ms. O'Connell.
Thanks. So I think it's best to not make decisions on the fly. There was a motion that the committee agreed to, and we should stick to the details of that motion. And then coming from that, if there are additional witnesses to be invited, then committee can do that. But just suggesting it here on the fly is not adhering to the motion that was passed unanimously by this committee. So I think that's the appropriate mechanism, and not just adding it as members see fit when we've already gone over the time for committee.
Mr. Motz.
There's a process for this.
Thank you, Chair. So just so we're clear, February 26th amendments are due. February 26 and 29 auto theft study is what the recommendations from the majority of the opposition side has come up with. And then on Monday, March 18th, we would begin the clause by clause of C26 with the view of that particular day, Monday the 18th, if possible, to extend those hours at reasonable time depending on resources. I think that would be very reasonable, at least to begin C26 on that date.
Mr. Motz. Mr. Julian, please.
I'm presuming that we have a deadline of Monday for auto theft witnesses?
I think you've already submitted them.
We submitted yours.
Thank you. No, I would suggest if there were additional witnesses that they could be submitted by Monday.
Thank you. Okay. Okay. So leave that with the chair, please. Draft budget for Bill C-26. The clerk has distributed on Monday the draft budget for Bill C-26 in the amount of $14,500. Is there any questions or comments? So moved. Perfect. And then we'll get into a new travel budget regarding the study and growing problem of car thefts. As requested by the committee members, the clerk has prepared new travel budgets for the Port of Montreal regarding our upcoming study on the growing problem of car thefts in Canada. The request from the members was to reduce the minimum of cost to the site visit. 2 options were distributed by the clerk. First one, charter bus in the amount of $8,199. And 2, a second one, charter bus and train in the amount of $9,399. The clerk can provide additional context and information if it is
Mr. Chair?
required.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
As a matter of form, the project was so moved, but we didn't vote on it, so. The budget.
Okay. Call for a vote.
All approved?
Yeah.
What's that?
You good?
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. As discussed with the clerk, I recommend to adopt both budget options in order to provide flexibility in the next approval step for the subcommittee or committee budgets of liaison. We good? All right. Is the committee in agreement to adjourn?
Thank you.